Good morning and welcome everyone. My name is Bill Roebuck. I'm the new Executive Vice President for the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, or AGSIW in shorthand. I'm delighted to introduce our panel today focused on the protest movement in Iraq and the impact it could have on this year's elections. The subject is incredibly timely, and a focused exploration of the current protest movement in Iraq will also help us understand how the protests are connected with key players and parties in Iraq. What we're talking about today is ripped from the freshest pages of newspapers and current events, but it's also from Iraq's modern history. Iraq's 20th and 21st centuries are indelibly shaped by a series of such protests dating back all the way to the 1920s. We're fortunate to have a distinguished panel and moderator for today's event. Moderator Geneive Abdo is a visiting fellow at AGSIW and a consultant at the World Bank. Her current research focuses on the shifting political and religious alliances within Shia communities in the Middle East. She's published extensively and brings to her work years of previous experience as a journalist in the region, including as Iran correspondent for The Guardian. Marsin Alshamary is a postdoctoral fellow with the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings Institute and a non-resident fellow at the Institute of Regional and International Studies at the American University of Iraq, Suleimani. She specializes in Iraq politics and US-Iraqi relations. Sajad Jiyad is a Baghdad-based fellow at the Century Foundation with expertise in public policy, civil society, and governance in Iraq. Among other areas of focus for publications, Jiyad has examined the underlying causes of youth radicalization in Iraq. Lahib Higel is a senior analyst at the International Crisis Group focused on politics, governance, security, and conflict in Iraq. Prior to joining the ICG, Lahib spent years working in Iraq with different organizations, including Dialogue Advisory Group, the European Union, and UNDP. I should add the usual disclaimer before we start that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website tomorrow. Also, a reminder to our audience, you're in listening only mode, but you will be able to ask your questions in the Q&A function in Zoom. You can also email us at info@agsiw.org or tag us on Twitter at Gulf States INST. Geneive, I'm delighted to put this program in your very capable hands, and I look forward to what I know will be an interesting panel. Geneive, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone, and good afternoon to those of us joining us from the Middle East and elsewhere. We have a lot of people in the audience from around the world, so welcome. As Ambassador Roebuck mentioned, protest has always been part of Iraq's history. But I think that what we have seen in recent years, and particularly since 2019, and this is also relevant to the region as a whole, not just to Iraq, is we've seen a new generation of protesters. In Iraq, the protesters are predominantly Shia. And in 2019, they began mobilizing in greater numbers than we've ever really seen before. And although this movement, and I use that in sort of a loose term because they are geographically fragmented, the demographics are very different from province to province in Iraq. Yet they share common grievances, including unemployment, high unemployment rates. Their grievances regard the corruption, the deep corruption within the Iraqi government, and also the external actors that have played a large role in Iraq since the invasion, the 2003 invasion of the United States. And the particular grievance of this protest movement is Iran's intervention. And I think most memorable about this protest movement is that these are Shia protesters opposing a Shia-led government, a government that they thought would cure some of these problems that the previous generation had experienced under Saddam Hussein. Since 2019, the numbers of the Iraqis on the streets have dwindled, and we're going to be talking about this in our program. But the movement has persisted in many parts of the country, including Basra, Baghdad, Najaf, Nasiriyah, where we just saw in recent days violence being committed against the demonstrators. And in fact, violence has been one of the defining characteristics of this protest movement. It has mobilized more people across the country because there has been extreme violence against the protesters by the security forces. More than 600 Iraqis have been killed and about 18,000 people have been injured. And this has, of course, made broader society in alignment with the protesters in a way that perhaps that hadn't have happened if there hadn't been such a degree of violence. The protest movement has created a new political order. And this is also a topic that we're going to discuss in this conversation. 70% of Iraqis are under the age of 30. And they basically, the movement now, we can even say, and I don't even want to, this isn't an exaggeration, but I think that we can say, in looking at the political landscape, that the protest movement and the Iranian-backed Shia militias are two polar opposites, two great powers now within the political system that are vying for control of the Iraqi state. They have differences in how to define a national identity and what citizenship means for Iraqis. And I think that we're going to see this struggle playing out as time goes on, particularly as we get close to the national elections in October. And this is the frame in which we're going to have this conversation today. These elections could be different than 2018, where only 20% of eligible voters actually went to the polls. The protest movement could galvanize more Iraqis. Some of the protest leaders are forming their own political parties. Others are joining existing parties. And so we are seeing now that as the election is drawing closer, that there's more political activity. And so today we want to try to analyze what this maybe new political order looks like and what this could mean for elections in October. At least they're scheduled now for October. As Ambassador Robic said, all the panelists have done extensive research in Iraq. And I'd like to first turn the floor to Sajad, who will sort of lay the groundwork for us to explain where we are since 2019. Sajad, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Geneive. Thank you for the Institute for hosting such an important event. I think it's a topic that's going to grow in importance as we head into elections, as you mentioned. Elections are scheduled for this October, but they could possibly be delayed. So I think no matter what happens, the effects of the 2019 protests will continue for the next few years. And I don't think they will be definitive in this election. I don't think they'll decide election results, but I think they will have a generational impact over the next few years. So the reason why these protests broke out in October 2019 was just dissatisfaction with the government's economic provisions. The fact that you had graduates who were protesting before October, who were met with a heavy-handed response by the government. You had young people who had no real opportunities. They came from some of the poor areas in Baghdad, and you had people who had been who were activists, but who had been critical of the government for many, many years and critical of the system as a whole. So you had sort of three different socioeconomic groupings: the graduates and the people who were looking for employment, sort of the young people who really had no hope for the future and didn't see any opportunities for themselves. And you had the sort of maybe middle class who were fed up with the way the political elite were managing the government, the political elite were managing the governance of the country. And they came together at a specific times on the 1st of October 2019, but it was actually a small group of people, in the hundreds. It was certainly not in the tens of thousands when it started. But on that first day, people were killed, and the government's response was extremely heavily handed. And then the next day, the pattern continued, and the government started to say that there was a third side involved. Suddenly, there were security forces being attacked as well, and the government said there were unknown snipers and unknown powers that were present that were agitating the violence. And you had videos that were shot and spread on social media by people through their cellular phones that showed people running away from the security forces but being shot in the back of the head, shot by tear gas canisters, for example. And all this led to more anger and more people began to participate. So it went from a few hundred because of the government's poor handling of the security situation to several thousand. And then there was a bit of a break in the middle of October, and then protests began again, and they grew larger. There was in the tens of thousands. But even at their peak in October, November, December 2019, you had maybe 200,000 people in all of the country that were protesting. So we can't say the protest movement was completely representative of Iraq's population. A lot of people sympathized with the protest movement. They sympathized with the slogans of the protest movement, but also they failed to see what the alternative was. The political elite closed ranks. They had strong control of state institutions and security forces. So what were the protests going to achieve? And I think that's what led to people's disappointment after a few months, that the government was so heavy-handed. Several hundred people died, thousands were injured. And really there were surface level changes, but that was it. Parliament said that it would support early elections, and we still haven't had them yet. It's been almost 2 years now since those protests, and we haven't had those elections yet. We had a resignation of Prime Minister, and essentially was pushed out. It wasn't an easy thing to do. And apart from that, we haven't really had any reforms. We've had more austerity measures. We haven't had any sort of increase in better economic management of Iraq's resources. So nothing's changed for the majority of the population. And I think this is what is going to drive protests for the future, the fact that nothing is actually substantially changed for people. And you mentioned we have a young population that is growing every year, and the situation is not improving for people. So things will only get worse. And whether we have elections or not, I think turnout is not going to be very high. So the last elections, the official turnout was 44.52%. That was the official number given by the Electoral Commission. But a lot of people, and in several areas, even officially, there was only 20% or 25% turnout, as you mentioned. And that's the concern, that in these intervening years, almost 3 years since the last elections, what has happened to boost people's confidence that they should participate in elections? It's gone the opposite way. People have lost confidence in the political system. So I cannot see participation in elections increasing. And that takes away legitimacy from the political system, added to the economic pressures, and added obviously to the fallout from COVID, the security situation obviously on the ground, and the tensions between Iran and the US, I think is going to keep the embers burning of supporting protests for the next few years. Now, because the security forces were so violent in their response, and there has been a lack of transparency and lack of accountability, any government, whether it's the current one or the next one, if it does not tackle this issue, is going to, number one, face the question of legitimacy. Number two, is going to have the possibility of such scenes recurring again. When you have security forces who are willing to kill unarmed protesters and nobody taking the blame for it, then I think that leaves a situation that could recur again and again and the same sort of result. And it shows the weakness of the state. One of the proponents, or one of the supporters of protests in the beginning was Muqtada Sadr, who has a political party. He supported protests, his supporters were in the protest, but he changed his position in January 2020. Towards the end of January, his protesters began to pull out of the protest movement. And then scenes that we saw in Najaf and Baghdad in February 2020, where they actually physically started to tear down protest tents and started to attack the rest of the other protesters. And I think that's concerning, the fact that there seems to be more closing of ranks amongst the political elites to push back against the protest movement. Now, since then, so we're in March 2021. In the last 12 months, protests have petered out, partly because of COVID and curfew measures, partly because people have started to question what the point of protests are, if they're not leading to change, partly because some people have been co-opted into the political movements and have begun to form parties or have joined existing parties and now have political ambitions, partly because there is no leadership, real leadership of the protest movement. It seems to be these disparate groups who have come together on a common cause, but there is nothing that unifies them in terms of logistical support and keeps them going. And you have the entire political elite who is dead set against this protest movement. So it is an uphill battle. And I think going forward, we'll probably see more attempts by the political elite to try to co-opt, to break up the protest movement through non-violent measures, through bringing people into parties, through offering some sort of soft reforms or very superficial type reforms to try to take away some of the public anger. I think that's probably the tactic going forward. Now, we also have overtones regarding the US presence and Iran's role and sort of other issues. I'm sure that'll come out in the Q&A. But I think that all adds into the tensions around the protests, that they aren't purely organic. There's some other political motivations behind these protests. And at this point in time, I think one of the best things that we can hope for is for de-escalation between Iran and the US. So that pushes away these political overtones from the sort of grassroots concerns of people, so that they can tackle the Iraqi government head on and hold it accountable, rather than be concerned about what's going on with Iran and the US. But also, I think for the US, they can be most constructive by, number one, not intervening directly in the situation. Number two, avoiding escalating political and military hostilities and tensions. And number three, I think just give space, give support to any movement, not necessarily just the protest movement, any movement that pushes the government towards accountability and transparency. Any sort of measure like that should be supported. It doesn't have to be people waving flags in protest squares. Anything that can make our governance system better, can make it more transparent, I think should be supported. At the same time, the US has got to keep up pressure for respect of human rights. It's, the US ambassador in Baghdad sits with the same people who are accused of attacking protesters and meets with them on a regular basis. And that's a huge concern for people here, that the US is in collusion with the political elite in order to keep them in power, even though they abuse and kill and attack protesters. So that's something that the US has to figure out. How does it keep up pressure on the government, but still engages with them, but does not lose respect and trust of the general population? I'm sure more will come out in the Q&A, but I just wanted to give sort of an overview of where we stand from October 2019 to now.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your insights into constructive suggestions, policy suggestions for the Biden administration, which we all have some reason to believe, at least a reasonable idea, that Iraq will have more priority for this administration than it did for the Trump administration, and also that human rights will be more of a priority for the Biden administration. So thank you for that. Lahib, I know that you have written extensively on the security situation, on the violence against the protesters, and as Sajad sort of laid out for us, it's a complex web of federal police, of Iranian-backed militias, some of whom, obviously, as he mentioned, are part of the government. They sit with officials, both Iraqi and foreign. So can you sort of lay out for us how can the government, obviously the question is always, what can the Iraqi prime minister do? Is he as sort of limited in his ability to control the security forces as it seems from afar? There have been some steps that have been taken, but can the government actually do anything about the violence against the demonstrators, which is obviously fueling more popular discontent with the government? And how does this sort of play into what Sajad laid out for us, the whole issue of the crisis of legitimacy within the government? So I was wondering if you, since you've written extensively on these issues, if you could please educate us on, what does this look like on the ground?
Sure, thank you very much, and thanks for hosting us. Thanks, Sajad, for that overview. That was makes it a lot easier for me to be a bit more concrete. So I'll start with a little bit of immediate background to paint up this picture, because I think it's not just a question of how the security forces handled it. It's also how the security forces relate, as you said, the biggest demographic that is currently protesting in Iraq are Shia, and how does that relationship between the fact that most of these security forces are, in some cases, even related to the people that are protesting on the ground, which builds a very specific dynamic, I think. So a little bit of a background. So I think that what we saw in 2019 is an immediate effect of what happened in Basra in 2018. Those protests were also violently squashed. The difference, of course, with that happening in Baghdad in 2019 is that it could spread. So in 2018, it was more limited to one province and some supported protests in other places, but it was very much related to the dynamics in Basra, which made it very easy for the security forces to pinpoint, not just to violently squash people protesting, but also outside the squares to track down those mobilizers that are effective in organizing people. And so already then we saw targeted assassinations, intimidations, different campaigns to try to disincentivize people from organizing. So with the background of the things that Sajad mentioned in Baghdad 2018, I would add one thing, 2019, I would add one thing, which is the failure of the Sadrist Communist Party type of alliance politically. So before, we know that most of the mass protests that we've seen in Iraq, at least since 2015, have been very much driven by either the Sadrist or communists in combination with unions or civil society, et cetera, et cetera. Many of the mobilizers in 2019 come from this sphere of actors tied to civil society, tied to the Communist Party, even if they were not necessarily party members. These people were extremely dissatisfied with this alliance and what it achieved politically, which was nothing. So, Sadr, for example, at different points said that he would go into opposition in parliament, which he never did, because he is not an opposition. He's a part of that system. And the communists were also seen as a big disappointment in the sense that they are a secularist, party that sort of went into cahoots with this sort of more Islamist stream that couldn't really deliver on reforms that people hoped for. I'm not talking about this in a general sense among the population. I'm speaking in terms of people that are actually mobilizers and those that have been in that kind of community. And so the pushing for demonstrations in October 2019 was preceded by different groups, even though they were very small, to go down and protest based on, how the student marches were hosed down, based on the grievance of Abdul Wahab al-Sa'adi being demoted, based on a few triggers. But that really made up for the momentum. And so, as Sajad said, in combination then with that extreme violence, it really prompted more people into the streets. And then when it comes to the violent response and how the security forces dealt with that. So on the one hand, there was a big paranoia within the government and within parliament in general about what this was, because the protesters or the mobilizers were not known, right? They were not the traditional ones, as in communists or Sadr or whoever. So this really fed into the narrative at the time of, we were in a situation where US-Iran tensions were really peaking. And so this being sort of a foreign conspiracy of some sort actually drove a lot of that violence, I would say, as well. So on the one hand, you have, police, anti-riot forces, and then this third side. What made it really difficult to differentiate was, and I would argue, is actually the linkages between the Ministry of Interior and the institution of the Hashd al-Sha'bi. These are sometimes transferable. So you could have factions of the Hashd that actually wear the attire of the federal police in certain moments. This is not only related to, anti-riot measures with protests. This has also been seen in front lines and in battlefields where these two forces coexist, in Salahuddin and other places. So commanders within these two institutions know each other well, and it's possible to actually bring in rank and file, from within factions of the Hashd into forces of the Ministry of Interior. And I think this becomes an added layer of complexity. It is not to say that, it's always on the command of someone in particular within regular security forces to obviously directly target protesters. I think that's quite separate. But that issue exists, and it becomes even more complicated in the provinces, I would say, where these things, these sort of relationships between different security actors are even more blurred. So what can Kadhimi in this case do about this? I think this is his main challenge. And we've seen that in examples, not just related to protests, but obviously related to, whether it's rockets targeting diplomatic missions or other things. He has a difficulty bringing out accountability. What we've seen so far is very little demotion of particular officers within the police, nothing broader than that. And it's known in Iraq that we have an issue with impunity among all security forces, but the way that the lines have been blurred, and of course this is something that has increased as a result of the war against ISIS, because it was a very rapid response, and these different security actors emerged not in a very organized way. It's still something that he needs to tackle. From what I've seen, it's been more tackled in a political way, which I think is a mistake going forward. So, for example, when Sadr withdrew his support from the protests, and as Kadhimi came on and took office, it became very apparent that most of the political elite did not want protests to continue. And so, there have been certain political deals in the background to try to prevent protests in a non-violent way as much as possible. And this is what has happened. But that means that you only put a lid on. The frustration is still there. And I think that the potential to mobilize again still exists, even considering the fact that many of these prolific activists are now self-exiled, whether in the Kurdistan region or even outside of the country. So I think that for the government, it's important to recognize that people need to have the right to vent their frustration on the street peacefully. And I think one good example, and I think this is where this can be improved, was on the anniversary of the 25th. Clearly, the security forces were not armed. Kadhimi deliberately had equipped them with batons and water cannons, etc. Unfortunately, that meant that there were more security forces that were injured. But in a way, I think it was an effective method on part of the government to not stoke further escalation than on part of the people on the streets. So going into elections, and I think election security is the most important for those that are trying to campaign and still, using the democratic tools that still exist, which is to participate in elections, is to secure that somehow. I know that many activists are saying that we don't want, the local police or the forces that are in our provinces to secure elections because we don't trust them. We want other forces. We want the Ministry of Defense or, shifting around commanders. And I think these are things that it's not easy to implement, but it's definitely worth looking into, at least having more than one force, just simply as a potential mitigator against escalation, because we know that things can be triggered very easily. We've seen that in Najaf lately. We've seen that in Nasiriyah, obviously. And I know that this is also something that is discussed, at least among the circle of advisors that Kadhimi has on these issues. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. That gives us a much clearer understanding to how this violence is occurring, and particularly your point about securing the election. Of course, that's very important. Perhaps in the Q&A, we can talk about any possibility of international election observers trying to secure the election. So thank you for that. And to your point about sort of the secularist / communist nature of the protests versus the more religious dimension, I'd like to turn to Marsin, who has done extensive research on the history of Najaf's involvement in protest movements in Iraq throughout his modern history. And she's doing research currently today. And I think that what, a lot of people are wondering about, and Lahib had mentioned Sadr's the way he disavowed the protest movement. But I think that what we have seen, and correct me if I'm wrong, from Sistani is that he has actually supported the protest movement for the most part, while condemning the government for the violence and also for the corruption. So can you just tell us where does the clerical establishment, and I know that's a broad term, but where are we with the clerical establishment vis-a-vis the protesters? Is there support for them? Do the protesters want the clerics out of this conversation? Are they anti-clerical? Is there sort of a affinity between the protesters and the clerics against the government, against the Shia government? So if you can sort of untangle some of these overlapping Shia relationships for us.
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. And thank you, Lahib and Sajad, for the excellent introduction. That makes it very easy for me to follow. So to answer your question, which is really important because we do have to detangle different religious actors, especially the religious from the political. So when it comes to the protest movement, particularly at first, I think a lot of people were enamored and really excited about the way that it seemed to have this post-Islamist or anti-Islamist rhetoric that was being repeated and, broadcast everywhere. And it was a source of excitement. And you see that in Iraq, there really is a fatigue of Islamist parties, but that fatigue of Islamist parties, as expressed by the protest movement, really needs to be detangled into the different kinds of actors we have in the protest movement. So I'm going to speak about that for a moment before returning to Sistani, because I think it's an important point of clarification. What we have in the protest movement, based on some of the interviews I've done and the people I've spoken with who are a part of it, is really three groups, essentially, and two of them are more linked than others. The first group is the civil society activists, the long-term civil society activists who we've seen in various protest movements, who have a certain political, economic knowledge, a certain framework for thinking, and whose vision for change really involves a reform of the existing system. And then we have different actors who include the demonstrator class that can really be divided into Sadrists and non-Sadrists, but everyday protesters. And those everyday protesters that really made up the bulk of the movement and gave it this astounding size and breadth, you can really think of them as having more of a revolutionary stance, or in other words, of wanting to change the whole system rather than reform it from within. And so these different understandings really lead to different outcomes, both electorally and in terms of the relationship and the reaction from the religious establishment. So in terms of their reaction to electoral politics, let's say, and something Sajad touched upon, in the previous election in 2018, we did have this boycott movement that ended up really shrinking the electoral pie and allowing certain groups to be overrepresented in the outcome of the election. And a lot of that then was led by civil activists who had this vision for delegitimizing elections through non-participation. Now, having spoken to them after this election, after the protest movement and coming close to this election, they're discussing a participation in the elections, and participation not only through mobilizing people to vote, but also through parties and, running whether, their own parties or in collaboration with existing political entities. But that really is a change. And so that's operating from within the system. And that is really important because when you look at the way Grand Ayatollah Sistani's representatives reacted to the protest movement, it was a lot of, protesters were saying, oh, they're clearly on our side. And sometimes the state would interpret it as, oh, they're clearly on our side. But in fact, they actually had the same response as the religious establishment has always had in Iraqi history, which is going for stability and going for non-disruptive change. And so the religious establishment was always pushing the line of respect the electoral system, respect the constitution, but also respect citizens' rights. And in that way, they navigated towards, at least as far as where we are now, towards the reform model. Now, to say that the demonstrators or the non-activist class would have been, secular or anti-Islamist is only partially true, depending on the demonstrator class, because as Sajad mentioned, a large part of them are Sadrists. So it doesn't really go in line with the anti-Islamist message that we've been receiving. So it's a lot more complicated than that. And the non-Sadrist aside, the everyday Iraqi protesters or the ones who are contesting the Islamist parties that are currently in power, are doing so while recognizing the authority of the religious establishment. And so they're really drawing a line between what we see as politicized religious figures versus Iraq's traditional religious figures embodied by the religious establishment, whose authority and influence in society has only grown through the protest movement, and whose role, as we have seen, is only to support and legitimize the electoral system and existing institutions for change. And I hope that answered your question, but I'll be happy to elaborate more in the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We've already received some somewhat related questions to your comments, but I'll start with the first one. And this I'll pose to Sajad, since you already spoke briefly about this. The question is, what has been the role of Iran in the protest movement? I know that's a big question, but perhaps you could sort of guide us through, have there been other influences by the Iranians aside from the Hashid, or is that sort of how Iran has played a role in the protests to date?
Thank you. So the key political supporter of Iran in Iraqi politics is the Fatah coalition, and Fatah is very closely tied with Iran. It's very supportive of Iran, and it is supported by Iran. And Fatah won, gained over 50 seats in 2018 elections, and essentially they struck a bargain with the Sadrists. It was temporary, it was short-lived, for the nomination of the PM Adel Abdel Mahdi at the time. And so, Iran at that point had probably its peak level of influence in Iraq. It was able to have one of its coalitions, one of the supporters in Iraqi politics, nominate a PM and advocate for some pro-Iranian policies inside Iraq. So very naturally, when there were protests against this government, the Iranian position was to be very critical of the protests, to be very suspicious, to believe that these were supported by, for example, the Americans and Iran's opponents. And so they lended a lot of support to Iraqi government, to the prime minister at the time, to security forces, to put down essentially what they saw as a group of rioters, of protesters who were not really protesters for legitimate purposes, who were there to essentially undermine, governance as a whole, and not just the political elite, but they wanted to tear down the country. And so there was this sort of narrative that was being put out in Iranian media. It was also present in pro-Iranian media inside this country. And you had a lot of people who then became very, very suspicious of the protest movement, saying that these were, paid agents of certain embassies of certain countries, that really this was not an organic protest movement, that this had a political agenda behind it. And the purpose was to weaken the Iraqi government, to cause a fracture in the relationship between Fatah, for example, and Sadrists, to bring down the most pro-Iranian prime minister we've ever had. So that was the framing at the time. And it didn't help that obviously here, social media and misinformation and lots of propaganda was used. And to be honest, on both sides at the time, there were a lot of misinformation that was being put out by people who were supportive of protests and people who were being critical of protests. And the Iranians took a lot of this to heart. They were pretty offended that they'd lended Iraq support in the fight against ISIS. They had lent Iraq support economically at certain times. Obviously, they benefited from all of these, but the fact is they felt sort of betrayed. They felt that the Americans had managed to pull the carpet under their feet by getting a large part of the Iraqi public to become anti-Iranian in such a quick amount of time. So they were extremely suspicious of the protest movement. Now, what had happened was that groups, as Lahib mentioned, that were part of the PMF, so the official state-sanctioned service that is supposed to act as a reserve to the Iraqi army and the Iraqi federal police, the PMF, which is now stationed in several provinces in Iraq and has become very, very powerful in politics and on security matters. Certain groups there decided that they would be the ones to confront protesters because it seemed the police Even the riot police were too weak to or unwilling to, and certainly the Iraqi army wasn't going to be deployed in such a scenario because they weren't prepared to suppress protests, because they were a fighting force. They wouldn't be able to manage protests effectively. And so these groups then either entered the scene as uniformed or non-uniformed, or adopted the uniform of the federal police, and they cracked down on protests because that was what they were designated to. They were suppression forces. So they used violence without sort of regard for any chain of command, without regard for repercussions, because they believed that they had the green light to do so. And we have to be honest, the government facilitated this at the time. It did not seem that the government wanted to stop this, because it believed, certainly the mentality of people in the green zone at the time was that these were gangs of people that were coming for them. So they needed to be giving security forces a free rein to stop this from happening. Remember, the Iraqi parliament had been stormed before. It happened in 2016. So there are scenes, a possibility of the green zone being overrun, of people coming in. And to be fair, there were protesters who were very, very close to the entrance of the green zone and trying to get in. So there were scenes, in people's minds in the green zone that they could be stormed by these protesters and potentially, attacked. And so they gave certain elements of the government, including the PM at the time, gave these forces the opportunity to go out and try to suppress the protests. And it was mismanaged as a whole, because lots of people ended up being injured or killed, even from the security forces themselves. So Iran at the time actively supported, maybe potentially through through the exposure of communications at the time, if we get a look at it, through logistics, through support, even intelligence as well, in terms of how to go about trying to crush these protests. And we saw protests in Iran happen, a few months after that, where similar sort of response was used by forces inside Iran. So certainly Iran's role was to support the crushing of protests. Maybe Iran itself as a state did not have a direct involvement, but it supported pro-Iranian or forces that are friendly with Iran in Iraq to do so.
Thank you. Marsin, you wanted to add something to this question, your comment?
Yes. Thank you. No, I just wanted to add that if we think about previous protest movements and the politicization or the foreign involvement in them, I was thinking about the 2018 protests that Lahib mentioned, and how at the time Iran was in support of them because of being against former Prime Minister Abadi at the time. And so the main idea here, and one that can also explain Muqtada Sadr's going back and forth on the protest movement, is that so long as you have grievances that can create mass protest, there will always be the ability of outside actors or within internal politicized figures to come use them, to support them or to oppose them or to try to use them in some way. So, I mean, this really explains a lot of the behavior of both internal and external actors throughout protests in Iraqi history. And I think for me, personally really explains what's going on with Muqtada Sadr. So future Iraqi governments, in order to decrease the foreign interference, really should address the grievances that underlie every set of protest movements that we've seen in contemporary Iraqi history. That's all I wanted to add. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So there's another question that regards the spreading of the protests on a grand scale to the Kurdistan region. And I know, Lahib, you have done some comparative analysis of the protesters in different provinces and different parts of the country. So perhaps you could address this question of will the protests on a greater scale actually reach the Kurdistan region?
Okay, thanks. Well, so just to clarify, my current research has more been comparing the provinces in the south and how the sort of Tishreen protests have differed. But it's still a relevant question, obviously, the comparison with the Kurdistan region, which I think is quite a different set of not of grievances. The underlying grievances of people across Iraq and the youth especially are the same. It's a lack of life prospects and being able to shape them and economic outlook, etc. But obviously, we're looking at a very different political environment in the Kurdistan region in comparison to the south of Iraq. And there, of course, it is the duopoly between the PUK and the KDP, which is the dominant feature. And there is a reason why we've seen, more protests in Sulaymaniyah than we've seen in Erbil or Duhok, although that has also been increasing in the last few years. I would say that the reason probably why we won't see it the same way that we've seen it in the South is because this duopoly is still quite effective. So on the one hand, let's say in the yellow areas, the KDP areas, you have a very efficient security apparatus which is able to prevent mass eruption of protests before they happen. I mean, we've seen, extensive detentions of journalists and activists. And then on the other hand, in Suli, there is more room because the PUK in itself is fragmented. And so I think the last protests that we saw were, of course, a reaction to the fact that there hasn't been, salaries for months. There are also parts of those districts in Suli that are also underdeveloped. But I think that to a large degree, that is also a result of different factions fighting against each other in the region. So I think that those will be more limited to the conditions in Kurdistan, which will not allow for the same degree or extent of protest as we see in the South, where the political scene is way more fragmented, way more, many more actors that are vying for influence. And so the lines become more blurred. I hope that answered the question.
Yes, thank you. So that's very interesting to know. So obviously in the South, there's more competition, I guess, more competing ideas and objectives. So I will throw this question out to the three of you. It's a good and complicated question. Will the new electoral law and system offer an opportunity for protesters' parties to build political power through local constituencies, for example, in Nasiriyah, or will traditional parties be better placed to consolidate power under the new law? So who would like to tackle that one?
I can tackle and then see if anyone wants to add on first.
Go ahead.
The criticism that I've always given about the new electoral law was that it was done as an appeasement measure, and a proper, reform of an electoral law would take into account first having a census for Iraq that actually looked into the geographic and demographic distribution of the country. Now, I realize that may be asking for too much in a short period of time. So from the perspective of protesters, and particularly civil society activists who are interested in running for office and in increasing their numbers in parliament over electoral cycles, they view this law as a positive thing. And from their perspective, it's something that can help them gain constituencies at a local level and rise up to parliament. So that's from their perspective. And as I said, from my own, I think it was just a quick answer and should have been done with much more care and much more precision in detail.
Thank you. Does anyone want?
If I can add to that, so 3 points. The first is that the electoral law, the way it's been changed, is not necessarily going to lend itself to allowing a great change in the political scene. I think it's just going to empower the current, political elite, the current set of parties to further strengthen their grip on power. I don't think it's going to open up the field for, new parties to suddenly come in and sweep up and gain 30, 40, 50 seats. I don't think that's going to happen. I think it will lead to the consolidation of the current political elite and their parties, because I don't think there has been enough changed in there to allow, significant developments on the ground in terms of political participation. Number two, obviously, I don't think young people are suddenly going to come out and vote because, like I said, nothing has happened in the 3 years since the last elections to encourage them to come out to vote. So I can't suddenly see participation being at 70, 80% and that having a dramatic effect on results. Number three, I don't think elections are the magic bullet. It doesn't matter if there's several new parties or protester parties, as you said, or we have increased participation, if it's the same method of governance, if it's the same sort of type of dysfunctional politics that we have that doesn't really lead to the benefit of citizens, then elections don't solve anything. In fact, they'll make things even more complicated. And then the last point, I don't believe there are any protester parties. I think there are protests that are using new parties that are using protester slogans. But I do believe, and I don't really like to generalize, but in this case, I do think by far the majority of any of the new parties that have been created have links to existing political parties. So I don't think they are purely organic protesters who have decided to form a party and are now going to fight it out with established parties who have existed for some of them for many decades and have, so much money and positions and power at their disposal. I don't think that's the situation. That's what we might be led to believe, to support sort of the underdogs, but I don't think that's the reality in this case.
Thank you for that clarification. In fact, there was an article recently in the New Arab which talked about, some of the protesters forming their own parties, but you think it's more an issue of being co-opted by existing parties, correct? You think that the protesters are more likely to be co-opted by existing parties than to create their own?
Exactly. That's what I think has happened so far. I think all new parties that have been created have some sort of co-opting. And Lahib was in Basra recently. I think she's talked to some people there as well. So I'd like to hear from her what she thinks in terms of participation as well.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I find this really interesting. I mean, I agree generally with what Marsin and Sajad are saying. I think that there is one middle way that some of the activists are attempting. So if we look at, I don't know what to call them, but let's say the hardcore Tishrinis that are sort of upholding some sort of values or directions that they see of this movement. Those that are sort of not in this pure revolutionary stream, which I really think is a minority. I think that what the protesters realized is that it is not possible to topple the system. They're way too weak for that. So there is a realization on part of some, as Marsin said, within civil society, others that are trying to look to it more long term. They realize that we are not going to have any significant wins in this election, maybe not in the election after that, maybe it's going to take 3 elections. But the question is, what do you do in the meantime? Do you organize as a party when it's very likely that you're going to fail, as in like you won't be able to get a single seat in parliament? Are you going to work with existing parties? Because I think that for some activists, it's actually a conscious decision. It's to a great degree, it's co-optation. I agree with that. But I think for some, they're actually genuinely trying that track. Is it possible to work with some parties that are seen as more moderate to get more people to vote for candidates that they believe in? And I think this is where the law gives room for that because it's so localized. So the difference this time around is that if you manage to rally constituents to go and vote in your specific electoral district on a specific candidate, then at least you can hold that candidate accountable later on. And I think this is a kind of a sophisticated way of looking at it. It's not that all protesters are looking at it this way, but I know that some are considering this. So some of the protesters in Basra, in Baghdad, in a few other provinces where I've spoken with them are trying to look at this. Okay, so what can we do for this specific electoral district? Can we get people that are like-minded, people within our tribe, people within, whoever that sort of believes in this need for change to elevate a few candidates that can be seen as kind of loyal to the cause of Tishrin, let's say. But I think, as Sajad, that it's bound to be a big disappointment because there is no way to see change soon enough. And this is the problem, I think, of a broad spectrum of the protest movement that is also very young, is that there is really no trust in the political system, and the political system will not deliver in this, in the next period. So what is that going to lead to? Probably more protests, because there is still no real way for politics to change or reform itself.
Thank you. So shifting a bit there's a question about the role of the Marja'iyya in the election. I guess we should say outcome, I guess the run up to the election, but also I would add the outcome, because I mean, if you look at 2018, obviously Sistani had certainly somewhat of a role in the deliberations over the prime minister. So maybe I'll start with Marsin. Can you maybe give us some predictions on what their role will be, both in the run up to the election in the next few months and also after the results are known?
Before answering the question, I'd just like to make a clarifying point based on a lot of the research I've done with the Hausa, is that when you speak with elite clerics of the caliber of Sistani, but also those who are likely to be his successors and their high-ranking students, there's such an idea outside of the Hausa about its political role, about how important it is in politics, about how much of an influential actor it is in the political arena, whereas they think of themselves primarily as an academic institution and are loath to be drawn into politics. And that really can be demonstrated by the carefully measured stances that they take. And so there is a line that we have to draw between politicized clerics who happen to be, say, from prominent clerical families, but who have chosen to pursue a life of politics, and those within the religious establishment, as well as the interlocutors and intermediaries that operate between the two, that may give off a more interventionist or politically active image than is strictly necessary or advisable. So with regards to Sistani's role in both elections and election outcomes, so, Sistani's, his representatives in Karbala in their Friday sermons really did call for early elections. They pushed for the resignation of the former prime minister, and they did all this following an agenda of maintaining the peace between the state and the protesters while respecting the demands of the Iraqi public and trying to do it through a constitution respecting and electoral system respecting system. And that was the path that they pursued and that they will always pursue. So when it comes to elections, they won't, be taking on positions that are supportive or not supportive of particular parties. They're also unlikely to tell people whether to vote or not. It's outside of their realm of operation. If you ask them personally, they'll say, as an Iraqi citizen, if they happen to be one, I voted in the elections. And this is a question I asked most clerics I interviewed. And, universally, every single cleric I spoke with who in Iraq said that they had participated not only in parliamentary, but in local elections as an Iraqi, because as an individual citizen, not as a member of the Hausa, they felt that they had to. But they also were very clear at saying that it's not our role to tell people that they should vote or not. And so I think that those conversations I had following the 2018 elections will be carried into this one. And I think the political bargaining that happens behind closed doors to assign a prime minister or to select a prime minister will take place between Islamist parties with informal ties to the Marja'iyya, given the long history of how religion and opposition groups in the Ba'athist era really created a lot of the parties that we have today, but also with other groups that are Iraq's traditional, political parties that existed in the post-2003 world. I don't know if Sajad or Lahib would like to add to that.
We're sort of running out of time, so if you want to add just something very briefly.
Very quickly. So, Sistani, and I've heard this firsthand from him, he believes in having sort of a coalition or a party in government and a coalition/party who are opposition. And it comes to elections, and these two will battle it out. That's what he wants to see. And something similar to what happens in America, two big parties slugging it out for votes and trying to, outdo each other in terms of policies, at least. That's what he wants to see, which is why he will not support a revolutionary mindset. He wants to see change to the system. The problem we've had so far in this country is that we've produced weak parliaments and weak governments, and nobody really acts as opposition. Everybody's inside the government, everybody's in power, and at the same time, everybody's trying to undermine each other through those institutions. Until we move away from that mindset, we will always be facing the same sort of scenario. And I think that's what's disappointed Sistani so much, is that he believes there is potential for the constitution, for the political system to work. But these political elite have undermined that. And I think that's what disappointed him. But he wants to support, creation of new parties because he believes that's the right way to approach this for longer term and sustainable change by fighting it out at elections.
Okay, thank you. So we have time for one more question, and it regards violence against women. And I regret that we haven't had a chance to talk about the important role that women have played in the protest movement in Iraq. So if anyone would like to just answer this briefly, we obviously, women have been killed. Some women have even been killed who are outspoken in Iraq. So can you perhaps, Lahib, you could explain to us how you see the violence against women in sort of a political context?
Okay, I will make an attempt in a political context. That's a difficult one, but I think that women had a driving role, but they also became a victim of the different competitions that were going on. And I think that there are a few different fault lines. One is, of course, related to the narratives about religion and how Marsin was saying before that there wasn't. It's not so much a question about secularism versus Islamism, and I actually agree with that. I think that is something that to a large extent was imposed on the protest movement. And I saw another question that was about the term jokers, and I think this is very much where it came from. So in order to sow tensions and to stain the movement in terms of what it was about, you impose these ideas of that being kind of against social norms, against cultural norms, against religious norms. And this is where women really became a victim of it. At one point, Sadr was calling for gender segregations in the protest squares, for example, which was highly rejected by, there was a women's marches in response to that, and very much was also supported by younger men. So I think that there is definitely a change culturally among the younger generation in terms of what women's participation is about. Unfortunately, I think still it's very much used politically against them, to be framed in a way that this is not appropriate for many different reasons. And there are so many attempts where that was elevated, coming to a point, and I spoke with a lot of women that participated in the protests, also in, let's say, more conservative or socially conservative provinces in the south, such as Diwani and other places, where young women would have their mothers coming with them to the protest site in support to show that my daughter is not up to something bad here, right? And then with time, what happened is because there was such a big pressure, both social media campaigns against it and for other reasons, many women also felt that they had to retreat. Or parents would disincentivize their daughters from participating because it could harm them, either physically or reputation-wise, etc. And so this is a big issue. I think this is the biggest challenge for women's participation. But also, it's proven that there is a lot of determination to stand up against that sort of thing.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have to close our discussion, and I just want to thank all three of you. You're doing a great service, producing very, very detailed research on the ground in Iraq, and you've given us such a very nuanced and in-depth analysis of this issue. So thank you very much. Please stay safe. And I want to also thank the audience for joining us and for your participation. And please continue to look at the AGSIW website. It's agsiw.org. There are daily updates, blog posts about events in the Middle East, and there are webinars every week. So please continue to follow our work, and we'll look forward to seeing you again in future events. Thank you very much.